Today we're going to read some Jean-Jacques Rousseau from The Social Contract. Again, we're using Aspects of Western Civilization by Perry M. Rogers. Great book. Highly recommended. The next section is from The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778. Although Rousseau spent much of his life in intimate contact with the philosophes, great philosophers from the Enlightenment, he rejected their attitude that the human being is a rational creature whose confidence in reason would result in liberty and equality. Rousseau advocated the elimination of political despotism, dictatorship, and the introduction of a new social order in which the only authority of the general will of the governed placed limits on individual freedom. His ideas provided the most inspirational justification for revolutionary action during the 18th century. So he's going to be one of the guys that drives the French Revolution and the American Revolution. Okay, he says, "We will suppose that men in a state of nature are arrived at that crisis when the strength of each individual is insufficient to defend him from the attacks he is subject to. This primitive state can therefore subsist no longer, and the human race must perish unless they change their manner of life. As men cannot create for themselves new forces, but merely unite and direct those which already exist, the only means they can employ for the preservation is to form by aggregation an assemblage of forces that may be able to resist all assaults, be put in motion as one body, and act in concert upon all occasions." So essentially he's saying that, and once again, this is the state of nature. How did we go from not being governed to being governed? And he says, we get to a point where we can't protect ourselves from the outside attacks of some bad guys out there, and so we're going to come together and form some type of government, some way to direct the strength of all of us to protect all of us. This assemblage of forces must be produced by the concurrence of many, as the force and the liberty of a man are the chief instruments of his preservation. How can he engage them without danger and without neglecting the care which is due to himself? This doubt, which leads directly to my subject, may be expressed in these words. So how can you give up your power to a group of people to protect yourself and still maintain your individual liberty? Where shall we find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole aggregate force the person and property of each individual, and by which every person, while united with all, shall obey only himself and remain as free as before the union? Such is the fundamental problem of which the social contract, gives a solution. So, how can you join with other people to form a government and maintain your individual freedom? The articles of this contract are so unalterably fixed by the nature of the act of forming this government that the least modification renders them vain and of no effect. They are the same everywhere and are everywhere understood and admitted, even though they may never have been formally announced. So that when once the social pact is violated by, in any instance, all obligations it created cease, and each individual is restored to his original rights. Each individual is restored to his original rights and resumes native liberty as the consequence of losing that conventional liberty for which he exchanged them. And this is really important because essentially Rousseau is saying, like Locke said, that if the government takes away your rights, you can revolt against it. But Rousseau seems to be indicating here that the slightest provocation on the part of the government to take away a person's rights results in that government being completely ineffective, of no substance, and no one needs to follow it anymore. It's immediately gone and there's a revolution. And remember this when we start talking about the French Revolution, because the French Revolution consists of one revolution after another, after another, after another. Governments rise and fall seemingly by the whims of the people. Okay. All the articles of the social contract will, when clearly understood, be found reducible to this single point: the total alienation of each associate and all his rights to the whole community. So you're going to give up all your rights to the community. For every individual gives himself up entirely the condition of every person is alike. In being so, it would not be the interest of anyone to render himself offensive to others. So he essentially says because everybody gives up their rights to the whole community, then people naturally won't want to do anything to harm anyone else in this community because everybody's given up the same amount of rights and is totally dependent on each other. Moreover, the alienation is made without any reserve. The union is as complete as it can be, and no associate has a claim to anything, for if any individual wants to retain rights not enjoyed in general by all, as there would be no common superior to decide between him and the public, each person being in some points his own proper judge, would soon pretend to be so in everything, and thus would the state of nature be revived and the association become tyrannical or be annihilated. And so if anybody does try to gain more rights over the people in this association, in this government, immediately everybody else tries to do all the same thing, and the government is instantly annihilated. It's gone. Okay, finally, each person gives himself to all, but not to any individual. And there is no one associate over whom the same right is not acquired, which is ceded to him by others. Each gains an equivalent for what he loses, and finds his force increased for preserving that which he possesses. So we give up I give up my rights to this association, but in return I gain the rights of everybody in the association, which makes me and my property much more likely to be protected by all. So also, I've only given my rights to the community, not to any one person in the community, so that way no one person is going to have one power over me or anyone else. If therefore we exclude from the social compact all that is not essentially necessary, we shall find it reduced to the following terms. We each of us place in common his person and all his power under the supreme direction of the general will, and we receive into the body each member as an indivisible part of the whole. One group together making each decision based on the general will, which is going to end up being the majority. From that moment, instead of so many separate persons as there are contractors, this act of association produces a moral collective body composed of as many members as there are voices in the assembly, which from this act receives its unity, its common self, its life, and its will. The public person, which is thus formed by the union of all the private persons, took formerly the name of the city. Now it takes that of republic or body politic, bigger country. It is called by its members state when it's passive, and sovereign when in activity, and whenever it is spoken of with other bodies of a similar kind, it is denominated power when one country is communicating with another. The associates take collectively the name of people and separately that of citizens, as participating in the sovereign authority. They are also styled subjects because they are subject to the laws. But these terms are frequently confounded and used one for the other, and a man must understand them well to distinguish when they are properly employed. So, this body politic, this group that operates on the general will, has sovereign power to communicate with other nations, has power to make laws for the people to follow. And it is supposed to be for the benefit of everyone because everybody gets to participate equally in this government. It's Rousseau's ideas that eventually create the first election where there's universal male suffrage. Rousseau's a misogynist like everybody else, so he's not going to give rights to women, everybody else at this time, of course. But he does create the first election where all men in France get to vote. Sadly, he doesn't listen to Montesquieu, and the powers are not divided, and so that one body elected by the general will ends up becoming as tyrannical as any dictator really in history. In fact, each individual may, as a man, have a private will dissimilar contrary to the general will which he has as a citizen. His own particular interest may dictate to him very differently from the common interest. His mind, naturally and absolutely independent, may regard what he owes to the common cause as a gratuitous contribution, the omission of which would be less injurious to others than the payment would be burdensome on himself. and considering the moral person which constitutes the state as a creature of the imagination, because it is not a man, he may wish to enjoy the rights of a citizen without being disposed to fulfill the duties of a subject. An injustice which would, in its progress, ruin the body politic. So really, all Rousseau's saying here is that yes, in this kind of utopian-style government that he envisions, people can act against the interest of everybody else. Everybody is not going to act with the general body politic in mind. People have individual interests. And so he's going to offer a solution. In order, therefore, to prevent the social compact from becoming an empty formula, it tacitly includes this premise, which alone can give effect to the others, that whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to it by the whole body, which is in fact only forcing him to be free. For this is the condition which guarantees his absolute personal independence to every citizen of the country, a condition which gives motion and effect to the political machine, which alone renders all civil engagements legal, and without which they would be absurd, tyrannical, and subject to the most enormous abuses. And so in this little section here, at the end of this reading, Rousseau essentially says that if you do not agree with the majority, then you can be compelled to agree, forced to agree. And in fact, being forced to agree and being forced to act the way this kind of utopian, egalitarian government wants you to, it is only forcing you to be free. And we're going to see this language in the French Revolution, and we're going to see the government that Rousseau envisions, while very inspiring to a lot of people at first, is going to end up committing the worst atrocities in the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror. Because essentially, one group of people running by the concept of majority rules is just as tyrannical as one person acting in their own will. Good? Okay. Thanks for listening.